Okay, lecture number 3, diving right back into it. And this period, we're really looking at the interwar period, that is between 1918 and 1938, the beginning of the Second World War. And we'll talk a bit about how the Second World War was a continuation of a lot of the issues that happened during the First World War. So we got to get to the end of the First World War to really have this make any sense. Something very significant takes place beginning in October 1917. One of the major players in the First World War is going to drop out. They're going to sign an armistice. They're going to surrender to the Germans on the Eastern Front. And this is the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire suffered tremendously during the First World War because the Russians were largely a agricultural people still. The Industrial Revolution had taken place in some parts of Russia, but most of Russia, especially everything east of what's the capital, everything east of the capital was really still the Third World. Most places had no electricity, running water, and things like that. And peasants were being drafted from these parts of Russia, these highly unindustrialized sections of Russia, and being put to war on the Eastern Front. And they were often unarmed, unclothed, unfed. And so there was a very large popular pushback to the First World War from the Russian people, especially as it dragged on. Had the war ended quickly, perhaps there wouldn't have been Russian pushback, but there was, because people were going to die, often unarmed, like I said, unclothed and unfed. And what happened was a group of radical socialists, these thinkers who really bought into the ideas of Karl Marx, organized a series of revolutions against the Tsar, right? The Russians were still an empire controlled by an emperor or a Tsar in Russian. And Tsar Nicholas II became a very easy target for all of the problems, whether they be social, military, or economic, in the Russian Empire. And the Russian Revolution that begins in October, the Red Revolution of 1917, this Russian Revolution eventually will cause the ousting of the Tsar. He'll be ousted, his family will be captured, he'll be captured, he and his family will eventually be executed under mysterious circumstances. If you're Disney fans, think Anastasia. This is the exact period we're talking about. And you'll have the rise of the Red or Communist Russia. And, that spirals, and we can talk a little bit about that a bit more in the next lecture, but that spirals into a whole new thing in the creation of the USSR. But for immediate purposes, it means that the Russians have withdrawn themselves from fighting in the First World War, which is a huge benefit to the Germans because now they can successfully end fighting on the Eastern Front and shift all of their attention to the Western Front, which is bad news for the French and the British, who are going to continue to fight against the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans. Unfortunately, however, for the Russians, prior to that, a very popular passenger ship known as the Lusitania was torpedoed by a German U-boat in the Atlantic. The problem with torpedoing this U-boat, at least from the American perspective, was that neutral Americans, right, American citizens, were traveling on this Lusitania boat, and the sinking of the Lusitania resulted in the deaths of Americans. And this pushed a lot of Americans who had remained neutral in the conflict, right? The First World War was very much seen as a European problem. It didn't impact the United States at all. In fact, it probably helped most Americans because even though the U.S. was neutral in name, it wasn't neutral in action. On the Lusitania were ammunitions and supplies being sent to Great Britain. And this is why the boat was torpedoed. The Germans knew that the British were using passenger ships to take supplies from the United States to Great Britain. And they issued warnings. The New York Times ran an article only a couple weeks before the Lusitania was sank from the German embassy in the United States, in New York, that said, Americans, do not board British ocean liners because we're sinking them. We know for a fact that they're smuggling goods and ammunitions on these ships. Americans don't heed this warning, and a bunch of them die. So the Germans sinking the Lusitania is going to push the U.S. Much closer to war. However, they don't formally join until 2 years later in 1917, and that's because of the Russian withdrawal, or the pending Russian withdrawal. They can definitely tell that the Russians are losing steam, even though the Red Revolution hasn't happened yet. And so the Americans joined the war just before the Russians withdraw in October of 1917. And this really means that the Germans, even though they don't have to fight on the Eastern Front anymore, don't have any real advantage in the Western Front because more and more American troops are ending up there. And it's ultimately the addition of American numbers that shifts the balance of power in what had been a stalemate in favor of the Allies. The British and the French, allied by American troops by numbers, supplies, ammunition, causes them to be able to win some of those charges, take some of that land, and eventually push closer and closer to Germany, forcing the Germans to surrender. War weariness in Germany, a lack of money, a lack of troops, a lack of funds, forces the Germans to surrender. And on November 11th of 1917, the First World War is over. Armistice is signed. And the end of the First World War raises a lot of questions, right? What's going to happen to Europe? Are they going to try to develop in 1918 a system a lot like they had in 1815? Are they going to try to create a balance of power? And if you look back on that map in their PowerPoint from 1815, you'll notice that even though Napoleon had been the one who had conquered all of Europe, and 1815 was trying to rectify the damage he had done, France was not punished. France remained an independent country. The same thing is not going to be said for the end of the First World War. Germany is going to be very heavily punished, much to the dismay of the United States President Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson goes to Versailles, which is where they're going to argue about what the new order of Europe looks like in 1918, with 14 points. And you can read those 14 points here. But his basic idea in his 14 points was to try and avoid another global conflict like the First World War. And all of his 14 points were aimed at de-escalating the tensions around Europe. Open diplomacy, freedom of seas, removal of economic barriers, a reduction in arms, adjustment of colonies, right? Restoration of the Russian conquered territories, preservation of Belgian sovereignty. Remember, Belgium had been invaded as a neutral country. All of these things were to try to create not necessarily a balance of power, but systems that would avoid another global conflict. You'll notice the 14th point is a creation of an association of nations, what will eventually be called the League of Nations, the precursor to the UN. This League of Nations was meant as a group of elected individuals from each nation to go and discuss with other elected individuals in order to avoid war. But the Treaty of Versailles, as it's worked out finally in 1918, doesn't really pay much attention to Woodrow Wilson. It does give him that League of Nations, but in the biggest irony of all time, when Woodrow Wilson brings the Treaty of Versailles back to the United States, Congress rejects it. They want no part in the League of Nations because it means they couldn't remain neutral if this ever happens again, which, by the way, it does, and the U.S. does remain neutral, at least till a time. So we'll look at that in a second. So then what happens in 1918 at the Treaty of Versailles? Well, ultimately the Germans are punished. They're punished with a huge sum of reparations, right? Payments that have to be made to the victorious Allied nations, right? To the equivalent of 55 billion Deutschmarks, which is an unimaginable sum at the time. I know we have billions of dollars used a lot in modern currency, but billions of dollars in 1918 meant even more vast sums of money. And these reparations were seen as totally unpayable. There's no way that Germany could have come up with these reparations in a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades, 4 decades, 5 decades. The amount of economic punishment put on the Germans was just so vast. So what are the consequences? Well, first is those payment of reparations, right? Germany only finished paying off their First World War reparations in 2010. So just think about that for a moment. So first they have to pay this 55 billion Deutschmark reparation sum, which is totally impossible. Second, they had to totally disband their army and their navy, which seemed like a good idea at the time, but is definitely going to anger a lot of German people. They have to return territory that they had taken from France and territory that they had taken from Russia. And they also had to make Austria an independent nation, and a bunch of German people who lived in what is now Austria, what was then Austria, were no longer German citizens, they were Austrian citizens. The ultimate kind of outcome of the Treaty of Versailles was total blame placed on Germany and total embarrassment to the German people and the nation. So what are these, it's more than just kind of an intangible blame. There's also really specific outcomes. First and foremost, the reparations place, these huge sums, created hyperinflation. In order to pay what they owed in monthly installments, the Germans had to print more and more of their currency. Any of you who study economics know the more currency a nation prints, the less valuable their currency is. I don't know if you can tell what those children are playing with there, but those children are playing with stacks of $100 Deutschmarks. That's right. The currency was so meaningless, people wallpapered their wall with currency. They played with it. They burned it to keep warm, right? Products went from costing 10 Deutschmarks, say, to 10,000 Deutschmarks almost overnight. This is how rampant the inflation was. And that means that they also fall into a massive depression. Although the United States and other nations experienced a boom in the economy after 1918, the early 1920s, by 1929, that depression that began in Germany had hit the rest of the world, right? In the US, it's known as the Great Depression. So hyperinflation in Germany becomes a global depression by the late 1920s. What does this mean within Germany? Well, within Germany, a small group of nationalists looked at the Treaty of Versailles and felt incredibly betrayed, not just by the French, the English, the Americans, and the Russians, but also by groups of people within Germany. They began this narrative called the stabbed in the back narrative. There were certain Germans who had undermined the war effort beginning in 1914 and then had sided with the enemies in 1918 to bring about these horrible economic conditions, poverty, disbandment of the army, all these horrible things. They weren't just products of the French, the English, and the Americans. They were also the products of different groups within Germany. And what this first very small group of people, these white nationalists, at first very small, grows into the Nazi Party. And by 1933, the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler at this time, seizes power of both branches of the German government. And the next year, in 1934, Adolf Hitler becomes not just Chancellor, which he had been in 1933, but Chancellor and President, these checks and balances that were established by the Treaty of Versailles to prevent any sort of dictator from coming fail. Adolf Hitler seizes both powers and declares himself Führer. No president, no chancellor, I'm just Führer, which means ultimately the dictator of Germany. And so what was Hitler and what did he believe, right? The Führer believed in a couple of very important things, but most importantly, the Führer believed in that stabbed in the back myth, right? The Nazis propagated the idea that the Germans should have never lost World War I. The only reason that the Germans lost World War I is because groups within Germany, specifically German Jews, but also other groups, gypsies, communists, non-Aryans, these groups of people had betrayed the great, powerful German Empire. They betrayed them in 1914, and they betrayed them again in 1918. And Hitler propagated the idea that the French, the British, the Americans had all conspired to punish Germany in tandem. That means working with these groups of non-preferred, non-Aryan Germans to bring about the destruction of the German Empire. It was both an external and internal conspiracy, really, that Hitler promoted, that he explained for the loss of power during the First World War. And he argued that the only real fate for Germany, if it wanted to achieve its previous glory, was to totally ignore the Treaty of Versailles of 1918, stop paying reparations, which he does, build the army and the navy back, which he does, and then start seizing large parts of Europe, which he also does. You can see here, Germany kind of begins in that blue area there. That is basically what it had been since the end of the First World War. And you can see that he begins annexing and physically seizing with his army using a battle tactic called the Blitzkrieg, right? Very similar to Schlieffen Plan. German Hitler armies believed you had to move into an area very quickly and seize power right away. You couldn't get in this trench warfare again because that's what had militarily caused their defeat. So Hitler promotes the Blitzkrieg, which is this all-out raid, tanks, airplanes, marching troops that march right to the capital, and he conquers large portions of the surrounding German area quite quickly. Meanwhile, most of Europe and the United States do nothing. And this is because the United States and other parts of Western Europe were dealing with that economic depression. They had their own problems. They had starving people. They had unemployed people. And they're looking to appease Hitler. Okay, he built his army, but that's okay. Well, as long as it doesn't create a war. Oh, he seized parts of Austria. Well, that's okay. They had that before. Oh, now he's moving elsewhere. Well, that's okay. This is called appeasement. But eventually appeasement comes to an end in 1938, 1939, when Hitler invades Poland. And it's the invasion of Poland that causes Great Britain to declare war against Germany, means France declares war against Germany. Hitler had a secret pact with the Soviet Union and Stalin for there to be no war. So France and Great Britain, the United Kingdom, had declared war on Germany. And ultimately what's going to happen is that the Germans are going to launch this very offensive blitzkrieg throughout Europe. And they're going to conquer, just like Napoleon had, huge portions of Europe. They'll quickly subdue France. They'll begin bombing Great Britain. Meanwhile, the Japanese and the Pacific are perpetuating a very similar thing. In the next lecture, I'll talk a little bit about how the war ends, although I won't go into as much detail as World War I, and the new world that's created in 1945. So we'll pick it up with World War II in the next lecture.